This episode contains descriptions of violence, including violence against children, and will not be suitable for all listeners. Welcome to Crime and Sacrifice. My name is Brianna, and this is episode 19, Marc Dutroux, part 3. This is the final part of our series on Marc Dutroux, a convicted pedophile, rapist, and murderer, potentially a serial killer, and it's been a rough one. Though there is an end to this case and to this story, it is, unfortunately, not the most satisfying conclusion, as this case often presents two new questions for every answer, I've discovered. This is precisely what makes the Marc Dutroux case stand apart from many of the other cases we've covered. One thing that does seem certain is that the extent of Dutroux's crimes will never be known. We'll also likely never know for sure who else he may have committed these awful acts with, which is perhaps one of the most unsettling things about this case. But I will try to wrap up this series in the best way that I can, presenting what happened in the aftermath of Dutroux's arrest, leading up to his trial, and what has happened since. Along the way, I will also touch on pieces of evidence that have been officially discredited, but that still seem valid to bring up, and some claim that they were discredited officially for a reason. That the authorities may not all be trustworthy in this case, that there could be some kind of cover-up involving powerful people, that this is not just the story of a lone rapist and murderer in Marc Dutroux. I'll try to bring up and assess each point as fairly as I can, recognizing that we all have our biases, and that with many of these pieces of evidence, there isn't a satisfying answer, and there are still so many unknowns, so much contradictory evidence and accounts in this case. But we will do our best. I'll pick up with a quick summary of where we left off in part 2, given how complicated and how convoluted this case is. Marc Dutroux and his accomplices, Michel Lelièvre and wife Michelle Martin, along with another alleged accomplice that Dutroux named to police, Jean-Michel Nihoul, were all in police custody, with victims Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delay discovered alive and concealed in a basement dungeon in one of Dutroux's many houses. The case received sensational news coverage in Belgium. Sabine found after 80 full days in captivity, when her family had all but given up hope. Laetitia surviving days of torture. But this sense of public celebration did not last long, as Dutroux began to lead police to the bodies of other victims, uncovered on 2 of his properties. 2 of these victims were 8-year-old friends, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, who died a horrific death of starvation and dehydration, and yet whose bodies were not greatly decomposed. They had been alive for months after their disappearance. His wife later confessed to allowing the girls to starve to death because, she claimed, she was too afraid to descend into the dungeon to feed them, while Dutroux spent 3 months in prison for an unrelated charge. Marc Dutroux even eventually claimed that when he returned home from prison, that the girls were still alive, but barely, that one of them died in his arms. This timeline did not make sense to prosecutors. How could the girls have survived more than a few days without regular water? But they tabled these questions as they continued their search. Soon, other bodies were found. The 2 missing older teenagers who were found with drugs in their system, possibly even having been buried alive. And though Dutroux and Lelièvre admitted picking the girls up, both claimed to not know what had happened to the girls next. In fact, Marc Dutroux eventually said that he had just picked up the girls and had consensual sex with one of them, had left them with another criminal accomplice of his, a man named Bernard Weinstein. This was convenient because the other body found on one of Dutroux's properties was that of Bernard himself, apparently tortured and also buried alive. And though Dutroux refused to admit to anything, police believed that the two had had a dispute about money. With all of these shocking crimes, plus the knowledge that Dutroux had been arrested for very similar abductions and rapes in years prior, that he had been released after only 6 years in prison, that he was able to continue basically right where he left off with little police oversight, plus a number of outrageous mistakes made by police during investigations that should have uncovered Dutroux's horrific criminal activity, rightfully sparked indignation among the Belgian public, many of whom began to wonder if there was any validity to the claims that Dutroux began making almost immediately upon his arrest, that he was only a pawn, one of many people paid to provide women and girls to some alleged human trafficking ring, made up of Belgians from all walks of life, up to and including those in the highest levels of power, and that Jean-Michel Nihoul was one of the organizers of this ring, which of course Nihoul denied. The case was already growing quite convoluted, with many people who believed that Dutroux was just a lone psychopath, and others that thought his claims of some grand cover-up could have validity, especially given that the history of Belgium's political system had been under scrutiny in several high-profile cases in the past, where genuine and shocking corruption was indeed uncovered. Those of any opinion could not deny the need to investigate this case carefully and thoroughly. So many in the public felt confident that the case was in the hands of investigating Judge Marc Connerotte, a man under whose watch Sabine and Letitia had been found alive. He had become something of a national treasure for his role in their recovery, many believing him to be a man of honesty and integrity, and likely just what this case would need, given the allegations of corruption and of a massive cover-up. And for his part, Connerotte did seem to care deeply, taking immediate and swift action as soon as Dutroux was arrested and the girls recovered. Connerotte assigned some of his best investigators to the case, ensuring that Michel Nihoul was swiftly in police custody after Dutroux named him in the case, and very quickly finding the 5 bodies on Dutroux's properties, beginning to uncover what seemed like a network of systemic incompetence, or worse. His dedication to getting to the bottom of this case, no matter how powerful the people that might be implicated, seems undeniable, evidenced by how quickly and effectively he moved. In fact, there were some newspapers reporting that he was on the verge of releasing a list of names that could be implicated in the case, when the highest court in Belgium, the Court of Cassation, made a shocking determination, unceremoniously removing Connerotte from the case on October 15th of 1996, only about 2 months after Dutroux's arrest. This decision sent shockwaves through the country, the families and public stunned. The reason given for Connerotte's dismissal was an alleged conflict of interest due to him attending a dinner with victims' families, in which he received a plate of spaghetti, a fountain pen, and his wife a bouquet of flowers, which the higher court deemed could represent some kind of conflict of interest, especially since it had been a fundraising event. Connerotte, for his part, claimed not to have known that the event was to raise funds, and many journalists have said that this kind of thing is not uncommon in these cases, to go to a dinner hosted by victims' families. That it was a fundraising dinner could be seen as improper, which is what some on the not a conspiracy side of things have pointed out, and it was within the right of the Court of Cassation to remove Connerotte from the case. But many in Belgium were stunned at this decision and did not agree, and there was perhaps a sense of unity at the shared outrage of this ruling, and real suspicion thrown on the entire Belgian system. Regardless of their real intent, removing Connerotte certainly gave fuel to those who believed a cover-up might be taking place, and converted more than a few who hadn't yet made up their minds, making it seem like perhaps there really was some powerful group pulling the strings at Belgium's very highest levels. Victims' families had already been planning a big march for justice for their loved ones on October 20th. But after Connerotte's dismissal 5 days before, the attention paid to the march seemed to gain steam considerably, outrage growing in the days leading up to the protest. Supporters asked to wear white in solidarity with victims and their families. On the day of the march, close to 300,000 Belgians took to the streets with an incredible outpouring of support for the girls who had been harmed by Dutroux. And many believed that there were some people being protected, and that there must be other victims out there. Many wore white and white armbands, others carrying white balloons, leading the protest to be dubbed the White March in the press. Some had the message, "Stop the cover-up," on signs and T-shirts, some even plastering it onto their foreheads. And many engaged in other forms of peaceful protests, workers staging mass walk-offs or organized moments of silence, others participating in sit-ins. Public transit employees offered free fares all day in honor of the event, and firefighters even came out and pointed their hoses at places like courthouses and other government buildings, spraying them down to symbolize Belgium's need to clean up the corruption. Over 1,000 police officers were deployed to try to control the crowds and to head off any potential violence, but the protest was mostly peaceful. It was the largest march and mass gathering in Belgium since the end of World War II, a testament to how much Belgians cared and wanted to show their support for the girls and families who had suffered, and how badly they wanted accountability for the many cracks this case had shown in Belgium's police and judicial systems. At the event, Melissa Rousseau's father said of the dismissal of Connerotte that it was like, quote, spitting on the grave of Julie and Melissa. And indeed, as soon as Connerotte was off the case, it does seem as though it may never have been handled efficiently again. The blazing progress that had been made under Connerotte's watch slowed to a walk, then to a crawl, and then seems to have stopped altogether as some toxic combination of incompetence, disorganization, and infighting continued to mar and slow this case. And some people believe that it was more deliberate corruption. But for whatever reason, it would be over 6 years before an indictment would be filed against Dutroux and his accomplices. In the interim, there were some things that Connerotte set in motion that may have helped to uncover some unsettling truths, though not officially, and depending on who you ask. It was a judge named Langlois that was brought in to replace Connerotte, months passing without much new evidence, as police did begin the work of removing evidence from Dutroux's houses, and still seemed to be trying to put some kind of case together. But there were arguments between jurisdictions, debates on how the cases should be tried, if Dutroux's more petty crimes should be investigated along with the more serious allegations against him, as Dutroux claimed that they were all related, all part of the same criminal network. But there were some things that could be considered bright spots in the investigation, which definitely have Connerotte's imprint on them. Perhaps biggest of all was the group of investigators that he had hand-picked for this case, and that were still investigating some of Dutroux's most sensational claims about a supposed human trafficking ring. Before his dismissal, Connerotte had implored any other victims of Dutroux to come forward, and tips had continued to come in even after he left. The lead investigator that he appointed, Patrick de Beets, began poring through the leads to try to track down which statements could be credible, if there were any that they should invite in for a formal interview, and worked with several on his team, including Officer Rudy Hoskins, that he trusted. A handful of potentially credible victims came forward in total, given alphanumerical code names starting with X1 to protect their identities in official documents, as police began having formal interviews with some of this group, who were later dubbed X-witnesses in the media. Their claims to police, if true, were absolutely shocking, seeming to confirm some of what Dutroux had been claiming about human trafficking and pedophile rings. Seemingly wild claims, not just of sex parties with drugs, money, and children on offer to powerful men, but also more horrific claims of torture and even some murders that may have taken place. Even a couple of claims that at some of these parties, men had released children into the woods and hunted them down like animals. The level-headed investigators appointed by Connerotte remained skeptical of much of these claims. After all, it's nothing new for cases that receive prominent media coverage to turn up all manner of people who claim to have some connection to the cases, but who are either mentally unstable or in it for the fame or fortune. But there did seem to be some things between the witnesses that were consistent, and some things that they might be able to corroborate. There was one witness in particular that began to change their thinking on the case, codenamed X1, a young woman who claimed that 10 years earlier she had been trafficked and had been present at many of these sex parties, claiming to have witnessed some of the more horrific events. She has since been identified as Regina Louf, not by her choice, though she has since embraced her life as a now public figure in Belgium, granting many interviews, and even writing a book about her ties to this case. And in 1996, she spoke with investigators during several hours-long interviews, all of which were recorded on video according to police protocol, in which she gave detailed accounts of all of the abuse she claimed to have suffered and witnessed. Regina spoke of an arrangement with a family friend named Tony van den Bogaert, who was essentially given free rein with Regina to do whatever he wanted with her. He began sexually assaulting her when she was only 12 years old. But not only that. Regina claimed that he began to pick her up some school days and take her to weekend-long, shadowy sex parties, where she would be prostituted to older, powerful men, along with other children and girls. She alleged that this was all part of some kind of racket, that the encounters with older men were secretly filmed by the organizers of these parties, and, as Regina later reported to investigative journalist Olenka Frenkiel for The Guardian, quote, "It was highly organized, big business, blackmail. There was a lot of money involved." Regina Louf went on to identify specific and regular clients that she was trafficked to at these parties, including several prominent Belgian figures, a well-known politician, a judge, and a banker and businessman with deep pockets. She also identified Michel Nihoul as one of the main organizers of these many events, and claimed that a young Dutroux was also present at these parties, but didn't take part like the others, was mainly there to provide girls and drugs to the group. Besides these claims, Regina also spoke of the torture of some of the trafficking victims, and of at least 2 murders she says that she witnessed at the hands of some of the more sadistic clients at these parties, that Michel Nihoul took part in, revealing specific, verifiable details about both crimes. Of course, it was now up to lead investigator Patrick de Beets and his team to see if they could corroborate anything that she said, as they recognized the gravity of these claims if what she said was true. that it would expose corruption and worse throughout the very fabric of Belgian society, could completely erode public trust in government and institutions. So, of course, they needed proof. They first tried to check out if Regina's claims would even be possible given her home life growing up. Her parents denied knowledge of any kind of sex trafficking or parties, and yet did admit that their family friend, Tony van den Bogaert, did have access to their daughter and a key to their house, did disappear with her for stretches at a time. It seemed then that what Regina said was at least possible. What's more, they even eventually interviewed van den Bogaert himself, and were somewhat shocked that he admitted at least to part of what Regina had said, that he had begun raping her when she was just 12 years old, though he too denied knowledge of these human trafficking parties. That there was some truth to the things that Regina said gave her credibility with investigators, though a lot of what she talked about seemed impossible to prove without further evidence. But the thing that ultimately convinced investigators to believe Regina's account were her descriptions of the murders she claimed to have witnessed. Both lined up to real unsolved murders, and one in particular convinced them that she must have been present. That of a teenager that Regina named as Chrissy. Not only did Regina accurately describe her manner of death, strangulation, from being tied up in a specific way that was not released to the public, but she also described in detail the room and house where Chrissy had been murdered, right down to the layout of the house and the wallpaper on the walls. The house, an abandoned mushroom farm outside of Brussels, had been demolished by the time Regina gave her testimony. But a 15-year-old named Christine Van Hees' body was found on property about a decade before, the murder still unsolved when Regina gave her testimony in 1996. Her descriptions of the house were accurate enough to make a former owner of the property convinced, without a doubt, that Regina must have been in that house, with its very particular look and non-traditional construction. The only time that Regina could possibly have been in the house was before Dutroux's case came into the public spotlight. Given that a body was found there of a girl similar to so many of Dutroux's victims, plus that Regina knew facts about the manner of her death that were never released, was enough to convince lead investigator de Beets and Rudy Hoskins to believe what she had to say about this case. However, it is worth stating again that there are some reputable people who do not believe some big conspiracy or human trafficking ring existed, and thus worth offering some counterpoints or other potential explanations for how Regina might have known this information. First of all, Regina could have seen pictures of the house, could have heard about the manner of death off the record. Another explanation is that she didn't know this information before her police interviews, that her interviewers fed her these facts either intentionally or unintentionally in police interviews that were never recorded. That aside, de Beets and his team became convinced that there was a human trafficking ring that had operated and had potentially led to these two murders that Regina claimed to have witnessed. And the team soon began looking into other missing persons cases that could be linked to this potential group and who else may have been involved. They noted that Dutroux had been a suspect in at least 2 other rapes since his release from prison, one in which a girl was found with slashed wrists afterward, near death. Curiously, investigators for those crimes seem to have stopped collecting evidence after identifying Dutroux as a suspect, whether out of incompetence, corruption, or some other reason the public is not privy to. De Beets and his team also began looking at other unsolved disappearances of girls and teenagers in the country that seemed to fit with Dutroux's MO and victims, comparing the timeline of their disappearances to Dutroux's bank accounts. One point that those on the side of a potential conspiracy claim is that even with a steady income from petty crimes, there was no way Dutroux could have amassed such a fortune. If he really were being paid to sell girls, as he repeatedly claimed to other accomplices and informants, even before his arrest, then that might explain where he had made at least a large portion of this wealth. And this was the angle that de Baetz and his team intended to explore. They discovered that Michelle Martin had several large deposits made into her accounts, often from foreign countries, after several unsolved disappearances of girls. Could this have been payment for Dutroux's sick services rendered? And yet, de Baetz and his team would never have the chance to continue with their investigation. As will not surprise many people on the side of there being some kind of vast cover-up, somehow their investigation, too, was stalled and ultimately came to a complete halt. This was the result of an internal investigation that removed de Baetz and his team from the case, in a move that would cast doubt on these investigators and the group of ex-witnesses that persists to this very day. Though it's hard to piece together exactly why it happened, the fact is that de Baetz and key members of his team were abruptly put onto administrative leave, as other investigators were brought in to check their work with regard to the ex-witnesses, reviewing the interview notes and the conclusions that de Baetz and his team seemed to be coming to. They ultimately made the decision that de Baetz and his team had potentially manipulated key pieces of evidence, including Regina's identification of one of the murder victims. The team members were put on paid leave as new investigators presumably continued with their investigation, but ultimately and officially ruled that there was no merit to the ex-witnesses' claims. That Regina Louf, perhaps the most important of the witnesses, had just made everything up, which remains the official stance of police investigators in Belgium to this day. This also seems very suspicious, but you can look at this in one of two ways. Either de Baet's supervisors were getting squeamish about a potentially shoddy investigation which may have been on the verge of naming powerful people without enough evidence, that could lead to actually innocent people being crucified publicly. And so they decided to check the team's work and found problems. Decided with such a high-profile case to remove de Baetz and his team. Or you could look at it as another group of efficient investigators that got too close to the truth, and that were removed from the investigation by some group in Belgium with shocking power and reach. Either way, this information was leaked to the press about the ex-witnesses and the eventual conclusion from the new investigators that it had all been fabricated. De Baet's name and that of other investigators made to look like they were the incompetent ones. More worrying still was the fact that the identities of the ex-witnesses was also leaked to the press, as several prominent news stations, one government-owned, began pushing hard the angle that Marc Dutroux was most likely a deranged lone wolf serial killer with a few close accomplices who took these girls for his own sick ends, which is certainly a rational possibility, but seemed a large shift from what had been the sentiment by many in Belgium in the wake of the White March. Another piece that aired on a privately owned TV station seems even more sensational and biased no matter how you look at it, publicly naming Regina Louf and making her seem like some kind of villain, painting her parents as victims and her as either a crazy person or some compulsive liar trying to capitalize on this now famous case. And yet, as Alenka Frankel points out in her article on this case, Belgium's Silent Heart of Darkness, for The Guardian, they completely omitted some very important facts about Regina Louf. That Tony van den Bogaert had admitted that at the very least he had abused Regina, that she was a victim dealing with trauma no matter how you slice it. And of course that she had never wanted to be publicly identified, but was thrust into the public spotlight by a leak to the press. All of this gives ammunition to those who believed that there was some large concerted effort by powerful people to suppress the truth, that perhaps they had even Belgium's media in their pockets. Another crazy fact that gives credence to these claims was that the murder of Christine Van Hees remained officially unsolved up to Regina Louf's interview with police, and remained so after her name was dragged through the mud, the investigating officers placed on leave or reassigned. Her claims did nothing to revitalize the search into Christine's murder. In fact, it took the research and reporting of a Belgian journalist to uncover that the investigating judge on that case, Judge Van Espen, had a close, personal relationship to the very person that Regina Louf had identified as being present and actively participating in the events that led to Christine's murder, none other than Jean-Michel Nihoul, the man that Marc Dutroux had claimed helped organize these sex trafficking parties. The judge on that case, of course, hadn't thought to dismiss himself out of a possible conflict of interest, even though he had represented Nihoul's wife when he was a lawyer, and his sister was even a godmother to Nihoul's daughter, and it took this scathing report from journalists to cause him to ultimately step away from the case. His connection to Nihoul does show, again, that Nihoul was certainly connected to some powerful people. Indications that the case was never well investigated, and as far as I can tell, her murder remains unsolved to this day. It's also worth noting that the official inquiry into de Baets and his team regarding the ex-witnesses, one that inexplicably took years, ultimately and officially came to the conclusion that his team, in fact, had never manipulated evidence. They were completely exonerated, but not before years had passed, the ex-witnesses already discredited in the public eye, and somehow still officially in the Belgian justice system. De Baets and 4 members of his team even won a defamation case against journalists from La Soir Illustrée because of this case for $55,000. Though they remained on leave and were never brought back to this case, with so many questions left unanswered. And so it was that all of the investigators passionate about this case, the ones asking the right questions, and the ones that seemed the least corrupt, one by one, all of them were removed. And it's little wonder that after that, the case languished for years, stalling even in what should have been the straightforward business of putting Dutroux and his accomplices on trial. The case file virtually unchanged after Connerotte and de Baet's team were removed, the national attention on the case slowly diminishing. Months and then years passed, and though there was no indictment against him and his 3 original accomplices, Dutroux, Lelièvre, and Michel Martin remained in prison, luckily. Jean-Michel Nihoul was able to post bail and was out. But even with so little progress, the victims' families never slowed, trying to remain in the public eye as much as possible, scathing in their assessment of what appeared to be real corruption within the system, demanding over and over that more be done, and many believing that there was a real cover-up going on. It would be 7 years before they would receive any kind of justice, an indictment finally brought against the 4 in late 2003, and the case slated to move forward just a few months after that. Such a long delay seems completely inexplicable, though there are some things that happened between 1996 and the trial that many who believe in a cover-up point to, with varying degrees of credibility. I'll touch on them now, but it's really worth researching this case heavily if you are interested in learning more, though believe me, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. The first thing that seems genuinely suspicious is that there were some witnesses, and a crazy high number of these individuals who, had the case gone to trial sooner, might have been called to testify. But in the interim, many of them ended up dead, outright murdered, or dying under suspicious circumstances. As many as more than 20 people in total, according to some sources. The circumstances of their deaths ranged from mysterious murders to more gruesome ones. One man who said he had potential information about Dutroux, admitting this to an accomplice, before disappearing. His severed foot was later recovered from a river. The rest of him was never found. There were others who died in alleged suicides or car crashes or sudden heart attacks, all of which people who believe in a conspiracy claim could be faked. In another specific example, one man named Bruno Tagliaferro was connected to the criminal scene in Charleroi and told his wife that he had evidence about the vehicle used to abduct Melissa and Julie, saying that Dutroux and his accomplices were trying to get him killed. He died in 1995 of what was originally ruled a heart attack, but his wife did not believe it, sending his body for an autopsy in the U.S. that uncovered that yes, he had been poisoned. She told reporters at the time that she would get to the bottom of who killed her husband, but she too died under mysterious circumstances in what was ruled a suicide by lighting herself on fire in bed. Seems a pretty strange and painful way to kill yourself. Of course, one of Dutroux's accomplices, Bernard Weinstein, did end up murdered, so this is not so far-fetched for those to believe that it was only Dutroux and his small gang involved. But it's worth noting that the majority of these potential witnesses died in the months and years after Dutroux's arrest, including one witness who was murdered just before a scheduled interview with police to reveal crucial information about Dutroux, and a social worker who claimed to have seen an abused child in a pornographic film, along with a known accomplice of Michel Nihoul. She had called police and specifically told them that she had been threatened, that they would make her death look like a car crash. Days later, she died in such a crash. There was even a documentary made by German public broadcaster ZDF called Marc Dutroux, The Dead Witnesses, that talks about many of these murders. But to explore the other side, it's also possible that those people were murdered because they had ties to criminals and organized crime, and they may have been killed because they had a risky lifestyle for entirely unrelated reasons. And perhaps for some, the official or stated cause of death, the most simple explanation, is the truth, though it's doubtful we will ever know for sure. What is important to note is that there were definitely people close to this case that believed their lives were in danger, including Michel Lelièvre, who had at first been quite cooperative with police. Eventually, though, he stopped talking, saying that he would be in danger if he continued, and refusing to give any more information. Even dismissed Judge Connerotte seemed to believe that his life was in danger, mentioning in later testimony that he always had to look over his shoulder, that he had had bulletproof glass installed in his windows. Perhaps the fear was unfounded, but it was there nonetheless, and had some real impact on this case. And there are some other things that happened in the years leading up to the trial, including a brief time period where Marc Dutroux even escaped while allegedly preparing for the trial. Police would regularly drive Dutroux from prison to a courthouse about 20 miles away in a police van to allow him to research files on the case, which were apparently so unwieldy that nobody was willing to make copies of them. There were only 2 police officers guarding him that day. Normally, there should have been 3. When one left the room, Dutroux somehow overpowered the only guard left, stole his gun, escaped from the courthouse, and hijacked a car before police could react. Some 5,000 officers began searching for Dutroux as word got out, quickly alerting neighboring countries, though in the end, a forest ranger found Dutroux's car stuck in the mud with Dutroux having run off on foot. Eventually, police teams and dogs apprehended him, with Dutroux only having spent a few hours on the run. After this, he was no longer allowed to visit the courthouse, the files delivered directly to his cell. And it does seem that if you believe that it was more than incompetence that allowed Dutroux to escape, that at least there were those officers that were not corrupted, and that took him back into custody swiftly. Still, this isn't exactly the kind of situation that instills confidence in government institutions, leading some to wonder if the escape might not have been allowed, if some police might not have been paid off, and that it was just sheer luck that Dutroux was later captured by honest cops. Regardless, his escape caused public outrage. The chief of police later forced to resign, along with a few other powerful people, interior ministers and a justice. Some had even called for the entire Belgian government to step down in the wake of this blunder. There were some other wild things that happened in the years leading up to the trial, and I'll just touch on them briefly. Some Belgian newspapers began reporting that Dutroux's crimes may have been linked to some kind of satanic cult that operated in the south of the country. Specifically, they reported that Bernard Weinstein, the accomplice that Dutroux had turned on and ultimately murdered, had ties to a group called the Satanic Order of Abrasax, and that police had found letters on his property, his desire to provide a special gift to the group for some kind of upcoming ceremony, written in a way that made it seem like this was a human offering. An article written in the Irish Times in December of 1996 discusses the subsequent raid that Belgian police had on one of the alleged temples of this group, which was really just a nondescript country home. 150 investigators came to search the property, showing the scale of the crimes that they believed at the time this group may have committed. And media could see police removing many videotapes and files from the property, including some potentially more disturbing materials meant for rituals, like animal blood and even 2 human skulls. The fact that the world was in the throes of the satanic panic may have had something to do with this raid, and it's difficult to find anything in the wake of the raid on this group, which leads me to believe that what they found on property was nothing illegal, maybe disturbing, but no evidence of abuse of children or other crimes. In fact, one member of the group named Dominique Kindermans, supposedly some kind of priestess in the group, even spoke publicly to the media and stated that they were just a religious group, that they had no connection to Weinstein or Dutroux. But again, this is something that those that believe in a cover-up point to, and it's definitely one of the weirder chapters of this case. Other things that some have said happened in the lead-up to the trial, or rather didn't happen, was that some believe that much of the evidence uncovered at Dutroux's properties was never properly examined. There were reportedly thousands of hairs uncovered in Dutroux's basement dungeon. Officials in Belgium claimed that these hairs were tested and didn't uncover anything suspicious. But some have said, off the record, that no, they were never tested. In addition to this, Melissa Russo's parents wanted the DNA from her sexual assaults to be tested too, since Dutroux claimed not to have raped their daughter. But somebody had. They wanted definitive proof that it was either Dutroux or that there were others involved. The investigators on the case reluctantly agreed to test, but have said officially that the test came back as inconclusive, that her body was too decomposed. But this description of the state of her body contradicts the coroner's report, which says that her body was actually in relatively good condition. Those that believe that there was a cover-up point to this failure to test as another indication of how much power this group might have. Police had removed mountains of evidence from Dutroux's homes. And yet, by the time prosecutors were ready to go to trial, they had basically the exact same case that was there before Connerotte was dismissed. And the bulk of their case was little more than parroting the confessions that Dutroux and his accomplices had already given, minus any details that Dutroux may have said about others being involved. Victims' families were disheartened, some certain that there was a cover-up taking place. But still many found some relief on that day in March of 2004, when the trial actually began. It was hard to find exactly how the trial unfolded, but one good and surprising thing was that it was actually relatively quick. Good in the sense that there was closure for the families, though perhaps not good in the sense of uncovering the whole truth of what had happened. I'll just give some broad strokes about how the trial unfolded. As the main defendant, Dutroux opted to allow media outlets to photograph and film the case, so there are actually a great many photographs from the trial. For his defense, Dutroux continued to claim, as he had from the very beginning, that he was just a small pawn, just one piece of what was a huge and powerful human trafficking ring that brought girls to Eastern Europe and forced them into prostitution. Prosecutors tried to paint this as false during the trial, saying that if anything, it was just a small ring of accomplices working to assist Dutroux as a lone rapist, murderer, and pedophile. Because of Marc Dutroux's accusations, there were 13 people who ultimately faced charges in this case, all tried at the same time, with offenses ranging from rape to conspiracy to drugs charges. The only other person with serious charges against him, besides accomplices Michel Martin, his wife, and Michel Lelièvre, was businessman Michel Nihoul, who had from the start denied everything, claiming that he had only crossed paths with Dutroux for something completely innocent, to get information about the repair of a car. Though Dutroux admitted assaulting and imprisoning some of his victims during the trial, he did try to deflect guilt and paint himself in the best possible light, saying again that the deaths of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo were unintentional, and denying that he murdered Anne Marchal, Jeffe Lambrix, or Bernard Weinstein altogether, trying to convince the jury that he should not be convicted of murder. Some of Dutroux's victims were able to testify against him, including Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia DeLay. Because of how much time it had taken for the trial to occur, Sabine was now 20 years old, and she wanted very much the chance to confront Dutroux. She got that chance in court. Both girls testified about the horrifying ordeal they went through, and were able to look Dutroux in the eye, in heart-wrenching and powerful testimony that caused Anne Marchal's father to collapse in agony. Sabine asked Dutroux why he had done what he had done to her. Dutroux remained calm and collected with Sabine's emotional testimony, maintaining what he had told her while she was imprisoned, that he was actually saving her from some even worse fate with an alleged criminal gang. Public opinion varied throughout the trial, with some speculating that maybe it really was just Dutroux and his small group of co-conspirators, to those that believed that there had been a massive cover-up that went all the way to the top of Belgian society, and of course many that fell somewhere in the middle. For those that did not believe a cover-up had taken place, they pointed to the testimony of Dutroux's victims, Sabine and Laetitia. Both of them claimed that it was Dutroux and Dutroux alone who abused them, that they only really saw Dutroux and Michel Martin during their captivity. Also problematic to the idea of there being some large cover-up is that Dutroux didn't seem to officially be able to share any details or specific information about the people that were supposedly in this ring. In total, Dutroux, his wife Michel, his accomplice Michel Lelièvre, and his alleged accomplice and businessman Michel Nihoul were tried together on a total of 243 counts. And in June of 2004, a jury of 12 people found the then 47-year-old Dutroux guilty of killing 4 girls and raping and abducting 6, and guilty of the murder of accomplice Bernard Weinstein. Dutroux was sentenced to life in prison, the death sentence having been abolished in Belgium, and the verdict was broadcast live on TV stations from outside the courthouse. After sentencing, and in his last official statement during the proceedings, Dutroux said that he regretted what had happened, but has never officially apologized. His driver and friend, Michel Lelièvre, was found guilty of being complicit to kidnapping and several other charges, resulting in a 25-year sentence. He had denied any involvement in torturing or raping girls, but had readily admitted his guilt in helping to assist in the kidnappings. Michelle Martin, Dutroux's now ex-wife, was found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and was found to be responsible for the deaths of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, receiving a 30-year sentence. In her statements to the courts after sentencing, Martine did apologize for what she had done, for the cruelty of her actions that led directly to the deaths of Julie and Melissa. Michel Nihoul, who had denied all involvement, was found guilty of drugs charges, fraud, and dealing in stolen cars, but was acquitted of anything specifically to do with the girls. This was after the jury came back split as to whether or not the prosecution had proven Nihoul's involvement. The judge then asked them to reconsider his guilt on a lesser charge of being an accessory to the kidnappings, and he was ultimately acquitted of having anything to do with the girls' deaths or torture. Nihoul was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, though he could have gotten as many as 20. Under Belgian law, verdicts cannot really be appealed or overturned unless there is some grave procedural error, essentially sealing the fate of Marc Dutroux and his 3 accomplices. The official finding was that there was no human trafficking ring. There had, however, been several official inquiries and parliamentary reports released leading up to the trial and later on that did say that police were inept and that they mishandled Dutroux's early crimes, that had they done their jobs correctly, Dutroux's second wave of crimes could have been prevented. The group that had been set up to investigate claims of a potential cover-up was known as the Dutroux Commission. They eventually released a 300-page document recommending certain steps be taken, which the Parliament of Belgium agreed to adopt in the spring of 1997, years before the case even went to trial. The recommendations included 3 key areas where investigators and the justice system needed to improve, including ways to ensure that all areas of law enforcement share information and work together in the ways they had failed to do so in Dutroux's case. Also enhanced training and different protocols for how investigators deal with missing persons, and overall reforms in how the criminal justice system operates in the country. But the final reports still denied that there were any high-profile groups protecting Dutroux, resulting in what was ultimately an unsatisfying conclusion, that they did little to prove that there had not been some massive cover-up. Regardless of what you believe, it's undeniable that the case has had a lasting impact on Belgian society. As noted in the Encyclopedia Britannica, fully a third of all Belgians with the last name Dutroux changed their name in the aftermath of this case. And years have now passed since Dutroux and the others were convicted. Businessman Michel Nihoul was released after serving only 2 years in prison. He died in 2019, publicly vilified and hopefully unable to continue with the kinds of crimes he had before, at least as far as we know. And it did seem like he entered a new Belgium after he left, one that wouldn't put up with corruption as it may have in the past, without the favors and protection he had once enjoyed. He died of natural causes alongside a new girlfriend. Michelle Martin, who was complicit in her husband's crimes, was granted parole in 2012, though prosecutors had fought fiercely to prevent her release, taking the case all the way to the country's highest appeals court. In the end, however, her parole stood, and she was released from prison in August of that year, a decision that had been expected by legal experts. Because of time served during the lead-up to the trial, she had been in prison for 16 years of a possible 30-year sentence. Given the nature of her crimes, and showing how much of an impact this case still has on Belgium, thousands once again marched at the decision to grant parole to Michelle, dubbed the Black March, as a counterpoint to the White March decades before. Michelle was supposed to be released to live in a convent in Brussels, claiming to have become very religious while in prison, saying that she hoped to redeem herself somehow. But nearby residents didn't want her there, and in protest spray-painted the building where she was slated to live. But she was released from prison, though it's unclear where exactly Michelle is today, though I'm sure that maybe this is intentional. As for Michel Lelièvre, the only other accomplice sentenced for a significant amount of time, who was found guilty of helping Dutroux lure and capture his victims, was released just last year, having served a much longer portion of his sentence, 23 out of a possible 25 years. The public was still outraged that he was released early, many of whom didn't believe the original sentence was long enough. He was such a recognizable figure in Belgium that when he was finally released, he was met with a great deal of public scorn, and was even assaulted at his place of residence soon after, presumably by somebody familiar with what he had done and looking for some kind of extrajudicial justice. As to Marc Dutroux himself, though he has admitted culpability in the most heinous and disturbing crimes imaginable, the imprisonment and assault of children, and though he was convicted of murder, because of the way the Belgian justice system works, he, too, has become eligible for parole, even though he was sentenced formally to life in prison. In 2013, his request at release was denied because of the parole board's very specific fears that he would be unable to reintegrate into society. Even Dutroux's own mother, Janine, seems to understand the danger that her son still poses, quoted in a newspaper interview before the 2013 parole board hearing as saying that she was certain her son would reoffend, that she regretted giving birth to Marc. Dutroux will next be eligible for release in 2021, a determination that will be more dependent on the results of a psychiatric report on Dutroux, court-ordered at the behest of his lawyers. Belgian courts will sometimes review life sentences if the defense can prove that somebody is no longer a threat, which seems to be what Dutroux's defense is banking on. One of his lawyers, Bruno Diaz, told the New York Times in 2019 that the years spent in prison had been sufficient in terms of punishment to Dutroux. He also lamented the conditions that his client spent in prison, confined mainly to a 96-square-foot cell, which Diaz remarked would lead anyone to dementia or suicide. Though, of course, the idea of him being confined to a small space does seem like a certain kind of justice. Dutroux's release is a real possibility that victims and their families still have to grapple with, along with all of Belgian society. There is also significant hope that Marc Dutroux will remain behind bars for the rest of his life, and legal experts have shared that Dutroux's release is not likely. And that is it in terms of what happened in this case. Something that became a convoluted nightmare for Belgium, that hopefully has led to real changes within the Belgian system, less corruption, and hopefully some of the things that we know took place would be harder today. In terms of whether or not there was a cover-up, there are smart, rational arguments to be made on both sides, and it very well could have been just Dutroux and a small group of accomplices. On the other side, there are those who still believe to this day that there are powerful people that took part in crimes related to this case, who have never been identified. If they were being blackmailed, with organized crime involved, this would not be without precedent, and certainly there have been instances of such corruption that have been later proven. The Jeffrey Epstein case comes to mind as something that is similarly murky, and even if you look at just what we know happened and consider all that we do not, I do believe that this kind of a cover-up genuinely could be possible, though the truth may be somewhere between the extremes. Some combination of incompetence, low-level corruption, perhaps some high-level corruption, and perhaps those that genuinely wanted to cover this up, not because they were involved, but because they wanted to try to maintain public order and faith in the system. At least there was some justice for Dutroux's known victims, and I hope that there is some kind of peace for those victims and families that were impacted by him that we may never know about. That's it for this series on Marc Dutroux. We'll be following up with several weeks of stories about hope. If you get a chance to rate and review the show, it really does help spread the word. You can find the show notes for this episode, along with all of our resources used for this and every episode on our website at crimeandsacrifice.com. Thank you so much for listening. What kind of person will you choose to be?